Okay, hello everyone. My name is Liz Stanley. I'm an executive director at Walking the Talk, and I'm joined today by my colleague.
Jerome Perez-Brassens, also Executive Director at Walking the Talk. Hello, everyone.
Hi, and Jerome and I are here today because we have noticed, probably in the last year, I would say, Jerome,
Yes.
quite a big increase in the number of organizations coming to us because they want to refresh their values. And we thought we would just do a short conversation, really, about what we've seen that's triggering that. You know, how, if you're in that situation, you might want to go about it, and just some hints and tips of things that we've seen, working well and not so well in the organizations we're working with. So let's just dive straight in. I mean, Jerome, I think for me, the trigger that I have seen the most is basically just that the company's changed, right? I mean, it's changed strategy, or it's grown significantly, or it's in a radically different market, or it's focused on something different. And, what was right at the moment that the values were created is no longer what's most appropriate now. So, I mean, I had one just a few weeks ago, a technology company that, had been a startup and have been doing business to business work, but to very small businesses. And then, 3 years later, it's grown exponentially. It's now competing against the really big players, and it was selling to big corporations. And so there's almost a sense of it needing to kind of grow up a little bit, and of some of those startup values just not being necessarily what's fit for purpose now for the next stage of their development. How about
Mhm.
you? What have you seen?
Yeah, I was going to say another reason is that the environment may have changed as well. So, for example, you may have increased competition or you're moving into new geographies. So, your environment all of a sudden is different, new customers come in. So, what do you do? Another example is, for example, the focus on sustainability.
Yeah.
One of our clients at the moment is absolutely working on that. So, what is happening is that they are moving into what we call the greater good, becoming a much more sustainable organization, having an impact on the world. And this needs to be reflected in their values. So,
Yeah.
environment changes, then you need to also change your values or your DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a challenge that I hear clients ask me a lot in that kind of situation is, okay, but well, how do we know what we need to hang on to and, what we need to change? And there's often a sense, particularly when there's really rapid growth, isn't there? If we don't want to lose what made us really great, but we know that we also need a few more things. And I think that's, it's difficult to give. There's no absolute right answer to that, right? I mean, it's a judgment call, and we help clients work through that and really prioritize, the elements of their original culture and their values that are still going to be useful, and what they really need more of going forward. And there was one, it wasn't a project that either you or I worked on, it was a colleague, but there was one beautiful example I saw of this actually, where the organization kept the same three values, but the behaviors that were underneath those represented, they had three underneath each of their values, and for each of those they had one where it was an absolute core strength that they wanted to hold on to. They had one that was more like work in progress, like they were kind of had it in patches but not enough. And then they had one that was much more of a stretch that they really were going to need for the next chapter in their development. And I thought that was a really, really nice way of doing it. But anyway,
Mhm.
I'm diving into detail already. We should still be on the
On the
reason.
triggers.
Yeah, what else have you seen as the
Well, there's another trigger that happens quite often, which is the values are not inspiring. So they're not necessarily, well, it's two things. They're not lived or they're not inspiring.
Mm.
When they're not lived, it's often the case that they were created by a certain group, sometimes by the top of the organization, or sometimes even by everyone, but they've remained words on the wall, right? And nothing's happened. So there's been nothing that's been put in place to actually live those values on a day-to-day basis. So the organization is looking at them and saying, well, this is our aspiration, but nothing's happened. So what do we do? But sometimes as well, I think you've seen it quite often that they're not inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I had one recently where, we did some consultation with employees, and people were just like, this could be anyone's, right? This just looks like you've taken it out of some corporate values manual. It could be any organization. It doesn't reflect our DNA. It doesn't reflect what's unique or different about us. And therefore, I'm just not going to pay much attention to it, right?
Yeah. One of my personal example is that I find is always a little bit weird is integrity. So
Mm.
sometimes I see organizations with integrity as one of their values, and my first reaction is, Well, you shouldn't be in business if you don't have integrity. It's a must have if you want to to be working and being trusted by your customers. Now, I understand that sometimes it's a reaction to something that's happened in the past in the industry, and you want to signal that something is very different,
Yes.
but that's not going to make it necessarily inspiring. And for me, it's one of the basics of a business.
Yeah.
Do you choose to have it as one of the values? I would question that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, that kind of leads us on to really think about how should organizations who want to refresh their values, how should they do it? What are the key steps that they should take?
Yeah, and well, the very first thing that we at Walking the Talk in particular believe in is that your values, your culture should be completely aligned with your strategy. It should enable your strategy. So the very first step to do is actually to look at what you're trying to achieve in the next 5 to 10 years. What is your purpose? And based on that, based on your business strategy, define the values that you will want to see being lived in the business to enable that strategy. That's
Brilliant.
the
So
first.
yeah, so the things that are the things you're gonna need your people to be thinking and feeling and doing in order to be successful.
And the key is probably not a long list of things. We're
Mm.
talking about the most critical attributes that you will need to be successful.
Yeah.
I sometimes see organizations that have 6 values or even 7 values,
Yeah.
and I like, are those the critical things? I don't know. What do you think about the number? I believe in the power of three, sort of, but
Yeah. It's difficult. Again, it's difficult to be absolute about it, but I agree with you. I think if you've got 6 or 7 or 8 values, it's just too many. And, when you look at those, when I see organizations that have got those, I also think, okay, and we're also going to solve world peace and the climate crisis. I mean, it's almost like it's such a laundry list that I think it loses a little bit of credibility with
Mhm.
employees. And you're right, it absolutely loses focus. I love 3 as well. I think 4 can also work. I think,
Yeah.
beyond that, you're at risk of just having too many, because when you think organizations also will then often say, well, what do these mean in practice? They might have some behaviors or some indicators underneath them. If you've got 5, 6, 7, that all just becomes quite overwhelming, I think. Yeah.
Agree. And then the second step is to actually look at your current situation, your current culture. So you need to do a bit of an assessment. The values that you have just defined, that you're saying you're going to need for your strategy, are they actually quite strong in the business or not? Are they lived by everybody in the organization or not? And that will define for you the gap that you may need to fill. So you need to know exactly where you stand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. And then the third step is actually, well, creating a plan. We call this a culture plan. And what it is how are you going to make sure that you're embedding the values in your organization? Because as we know, it doesn't happen by itself. People just don't absorb the values and all of a sudden start role modeling those values. Something needs to be done. So it can either be done in terms of what are the behaviors that are underpinned by those values that everybody will need to be role modeling day in and day out. But it's also working on the systems, on the processes that exist in the organization to make sure that they really underpin those values as well, that drive people to do the right thing. And also working on symbols. We work on symbols a lot at Walking the Talk. They're a powerful way of signaling that something is really important in the organization.
And I think this is even more important in a values refresh than in a situation where you're creating values for the first time. And I think, there are very few organizations we now see who've never worked on values or culture. And I think if you're in that situation then and you haven't done it perfectly in the past, and not many people have done it perfectly, there's always a risk there's a bit of cynicism and skepticism built in. And so I think you can't just go out with a big communication campaign. You've got to show there's some substance. And in fact, sometimes with clients, if there's a lot of cynicism, I'm actually advising that you almost don't do the communication first, that you really kind of try and make some big systems and symbolic changes and then try and get people on board, so that you're really signaling from the word go that this is different, that we are taking it seriously, that it's not just a campaign.
Or at least that you're doing it at the same time. So this is the campaign, but this is what we're doing on systems, processes, and across the organization, and to support your leaders and people. And the next step is also to make sure that you actually measure the change. So How do you know that what you're doing is being successful? Are you creating momentum? So part of the cynicism comes also from the fact that people don't see necessarily the change everywhere. If you measure it, if you can show that this is having an impact, this will help that as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
So how do you choose them? How do you name those values, Liz?
I mean, I think that is the really thorny issue, isn't it? That is the one where it's quite subjective. And so I think it's really hard to have hard and fast rules. But I mean, I guess the most common thing I see is, a single noun. So courage, ownership, respect, that's the kind of classic way. And it has the advantages of being very simple and clear. But I think, it can sometimes be a bit bland and not particularly inspiring.
Mm,
It can sometimes sound a bit generic and like, well, what's different about us? And I also think, there's a risk in it being so short and so succinct that then what organizations do is put lots of behaviors underneath it or put lots of explanation. And so in the end, you end up with quite a lot again. But I guess that is the most classic. I think another way that I see much more of now than I did maybe 5, 10 years ago is more sort of action oriented descriptions. So, stretch and grow, act for patients, things that are actually more of a phrase and that are more action oriented. So I'm seeing that come in a lot more, and that's resonating quite a lot.
mm.
Have you seen any examples like that?
Yes, yes, I do see that quite a bit. Some organizations prefer to go shorter sometimes, so rather than use a noun, like what you were saying, you still want to create a bit of a sense of action. So if you want to use one word, use an adjective. For example, instead of courage, use fearless, right? Which the adjective is a bit more active. So an example of one of our clients is that they've only got two words, curious and fearless. We are curious and fearless. I think that says a lot about who they are, right? Straight away.
Yes. Yeah. And what's interesting there is that use of we are, right? And I think that comes to, to what extent are your values really a description of your current DNA, and to what example are they aspirational? To what extent are they aspirational?
Mm, yeah.
I think whichever way you go, my top tip on this is that what I see is it has so much more impact when it's language that your people can really recognize and relate to. And so, I had an example recently where we were doing a consultation on the wording, and, we helped that client reshape, innovative and courage was one, I think, or innovation, which people just said, yeah, it doesn't really do anything for me. It's a bit bland. And they felt it was very hackneyed and cliched. And so we help them reshape that to we are game changers, right? Which again is the we, but there's something so much more emotional and inspirational about that. And it is actually also for them a reflection of their reality, because they have been very innovative within their industry and they have shaped that to an extent that people feel they've changed the game, right?
Yeah. And that makes me think of one thing. The values, I would always tell our clients, the values are internal first before
Yes.
being external. So those values, what is the purpose of those values is to define your DNA, who you are, and that will lead you to do certain things and achieve your purpose. But this is not a marketing thing, because some organizations sometimes confuse the internal with the external, and they build those values to project a message to the external world. You can share your values, but first and foremost, they're about you and who you are and what's going to drive your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Because otherwise it becomes a marketing device, and the risk that I'm seeing is that there's a discrepancy then between who you really are on a daily basis and who you are telling, for example, your customers you are. And we've seen that this discrepancy is creating a lot of issues. We've got lots of examples
Yeah.
where customers are saying, you're telling us you're actually customer obsessed, but you're not at all.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's been created in a sort of an external way, right? And not
Absolutely.
looking internally.
Absolutely. So, in summary, I mean, I can tell that we could talk about this all day, but people probably don't want to listen to us all day. So, in summary, what would you say is your top tip on this?
My top tip would be to be very clear on why you're refreshing your values. Because depending on why you are refreshing the values, you may do it in a certain way or in a different way. So that's what I'm finding. Organizations sometimes do it. they're not crystal clear on why they're doing it, and they're landing on something that is okay, but is not completely helping them. So spend time really thinking about the why.
Excellent. Thanks, Jerome.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, everyone.